have as a guest today Alan Day, who is an owner of a cultural milestone here in Central Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Alan Day has Cheapo Records, is owner of Cheapo Records, an institution that sells vinyl. And we hope that the interview will show many of our viewers and listeners across Massachusetts how important it is to sell vinyl and how important cultural institutions are and how rare they are nowadays in the center of big cities. Alan, welcome.
That's extremely flattering. I can't disagree with anything you said.
I'd like to start the interview simply by your perhaps giving a description of how your family came to Massachusetts.
Sure. My mother, as I understand it, migrated across the border probably at the age of 7, 8, 9, ending up in Lynn from Prince Edward Island. People traveled a great deal cross-border in those days, working in shoe factories, the woods. My grandfather ended up at the GE, my mother, and that was striking gold for a potato farmer from the poorest province in Canada. My father was an old Yankee with a French grandmother, family from Roxbury, probably not quite Mayflower, but they were there quite a while, except for his grandmother, who was off the boat somewhere around 1880 or so. Cooked for the Estabrooks and ended up marrying one of them. The person she married was Harvard Medical, and ended up with a livery stable in Dudley Square. So I have a certain amount of historical ties.
It's a pedigree.
Sure, pedigree is quite the right word, but I guess you could say that. And my father was born down the street. Here I am in Central Square for the last 40 years, selling now largely records again.
It's a cultural institution, Alan. It really is. For those of you who don't know Cheapo Records, it's a cultural institution because one of the companies there is the Dance Complex, which was founded in 1880 as the Oddfellows Hall. There's 7 floors of dance, and you are on the first floor directly adjacent to that, aren't you?
Adjacent and underneath, so we hear them dancing virtually 24 hours a day, or at least as long as we're open.
And as far as the number of records are concerned, Alan, there must be thousands.
That's an odd question, because I could say hundreds of thousands, if you include duplicate stuff we have in the basement, but a significant number, certainly 20, 30, 40,000 titles, sometimes one, sometimes quantity. We still have a lot of CDs, which we like to sell because they've slowed a bit, but LPs are carrying everything now. Your turn.
How did you get started? Thank you. How did you get started in the business? That's something that I've been wondering about.
Like many kids in the 50s, I aspired to be a rock and roll star. I wanted to be, as every 12-year-old boy in 56, Frankie Lyman. When my voice changed, it became apparent that I wasn't going to be. I was too lazy to play an instrument, so I just ended up with friends being involved in music, often as a spectator, and occasionally we would produce little shows. We'd bring in somebody that we liked. The Five Satins maybe perhaps had the last hit 5 years earlier. We'd rent something, a VFW or a cheap hall, and we'd sell tickets. Usually losing as much as we made, but it was fun to do. We would meet, oh yes, stare at the camera. I'll try to do that. And with various friends, probably did that a little bit in the 60s, early and late, before and after the service, much more in the 70s. I started buying and selling discontinued records, had friends in the retail business, and just ended up opening a store first next to the post office and then moved down the street into an existing business, which I renamed Cheapo Records. And that's what I've been doing for 40 years. Cambridge was a different place when I started, demographically different, but we've managed to stumble along and stay in business.
And it's become a cultural centerpiece in Central Square, most certainly.
Well, I like it when you say that. I hope there's some truth to that. Sometimes it's a matter of luck. We had lean years when LPs weren't doing so well. We invested a lot in CDs. A lot of them sold, a lot of them didn't. And I'm just lucky to have hung on, and LPs are coming back. I've got younger people with a sense of what's what. New music to me is probably after the 70s, and we seem to be doing okay. And I hope business picks up. And while I may not last that long, I hope the store continues perhaps for another 40 years. Could be wishful thinking, but who knows?
You carry my most sincere wishes for that.
Thank you.
On the screen for our viewers, Alan, is
Main
Quest Diagnostic in the left-hand corner.
Used to be a movie theater.
Did it really?
Where they had, I think, The King of Hearts, a movie that I never saw, but that ran for years. I'm pretty sure it was that building. If not, the building was in that location.
No kidding.
At least through maybe late 60s through the 70s.
Well, the idea is that this property where Quest Diagnostic is, which extends, if we look on the left-hand side out the window here, that's all Quest Diagnostic. That part that wraps around there, we can see in the screen.
Okay.
And the part that extends to this corner over here, that's all Quest Diagnostic. That is supposed to be a 20-story apartment building. They're going to tear this down and build a 20-story
The
apartment.
whole building?
The entire area, they're going to
I
tear.
see, on the whole footprint. What about the parking in back? Are they going to encompass that?
I'm not certain, but
Quite a bit of, it goes all the way to Bishop.
exactly. It would make sense to incorporate that
Sure.
parking, and then it would go all the way up to the McDonald's, right? So that's a huge a huge footprint,
Yep.
and there's been a lot of controversy about whether or not to allow that piece of property to become a 21-story apartment building, because they're high value apartments, and it would change not only the view in Central Square, but also raise the rents immensely.
Right.
And make the problem that Harvard Square has transferred into Central Square as well.
Sure.
And that's the reason why many Cambridge residents are not interested in seeing that gets built. But it has already been zoned, something called spot zoning. And the spot zoning is questionable as well. And the reason it's questionable is because building residential that height and at that expense per unit is, I believe, a written in stone precursor of the end of Central Square as we know it.
I would throw in that very few people that lived in Cambridge 50 years ago when I was stupid enough to get drafted, but let's say 53 or 4 years ago when I was an undergraduate student, the whole demographic shift happened with the demise of rent control. So you don't see many people that used to live here. Many of the people, I would guess, that are fussing are newcomers, relative newcomers. They probably have been here a while, and I'm sympathetic. If I were the landlord, of course I'd want to make the money.
Sure.
If I were somehow thinking of the soul of Cambridge, the gestalt of interactions between this and that, I probably would say they're going to get the building. If they don't get it there, they'll get it down the street.
Right.
So how can that be worked with? Is there affordable housing built into it? Will it really be affordable? Will it be available to, it's probably not legal to make it available to families that have been here for 40 or 50 or 100 years, but will it somehow not awfully changed the character of the community.
It's good you say that, Alan, because there are 20 units of affordable housing.
How many?
20.
How many units in the whole building?
I think there's 200, I think it's 10%. I think there are 200 units, and I think it's 10%. And that had to be negotiated. But the
Sure.
reality is, I believe that a building of that size with 180 units of very expensive
Upper income.
apartments, upper
Sure.
income, would be enough to really begin a
Change the
trend.
character of the square substantially, except that it's already been changed substantially, dramatically. And again, you could look at rent control. When it was gone, almost immediately, the houses became vehicles for investment rather than human beings. You know, three-decker, let's buy a three-decker, which you could buy for 25, maybe to 75 in the 60s.
Thousand?
Maybe less, but
A
certainly.
triple decker? No
Yeah,
kidding.
yeah. And well, I grew up in Lynn. We lived in a triple decker, then we moved to Saugus in a single family house. Dirt road, cesspools, but it was a big difference. But my cousins still
course.
lived mostly two families, three deckers there. Some of my cousins around here moved to the burbs. People were moving to the suburbs after World War II, and big en masse movement in the 50s. My grandmother characterized Central Square, which she had moved to maybe around 1910 or 11, living for 4 or 5 years, as the same right through until the 70s or 80s, actually, when she died. Different languages, different people, different education levels, poor people, white people, black people, foreigners, all somehow interacting in Central Square, and she thought it was great. She was an early born again, so it was an opportunity to convert people. But she was a wonderful person, spoke a number of languages, and she just thought that was a real place. People would compare Central Square to New York. If you were here in the 60s or 70s, it's the only neighborhood in Boston, or greater Boston, that just seemed to have a New York feel. That made it a great place for a record store because it seemed like you could get everybody. Now, the people that used to live here, maybe they live in Brockton, maybe they could afford the suburbs, you know, we'll see them once in a while. But I guess to further tear down whatever was left seems sad. But is there a possibility of blocking a 20-story building if it's already zoned? Is that realistic? Sorry, I'm looking at the camera.
No, that's perfectly all right. Your question, Alan, is perfectly straightforward and makes a lot of sense. The reality is that anyone living in Cambridge would have to have an interest in preventing the massive increase in the cost of living.
Sure, but do they have a legal leg to stand on? We're looking at a new era of perhaps right-wing politics, so are they, you know, is there an option?
That's a very interesting question. And if we're looking at the question about the president-elect and his generals and billionaire friends who are put in positions of power, I think that local governments and local activists are called everywhere in the United States to struggle at the local level with local issues.
Well put. You know, excellent, good point.
Thank you.
I would say.
Thank you very much, Alan. And basically, I think you and I agree on these issues basically because of our veteran status. If I understood you correctly, you were in Germany.
I fought tooth and nail to weasel out of being drafted. I was a junior. I was failing nuclear physics, not once but twice. It was a junior physics school. I was trying to be a smart kid, double major, and I was 1A. My uncle, the lifer, he was a Major General Reserve, I think retired full colonel. You know, a lifer, kid from Somerville, went in at 16. Education in the service, and a decent WASP. Nice person, honest, and very tall. He said that's how he got
You
promoted.
take after him, right?
He was 6'6" or so, 6'5", my Uncle Frank.
You're pretty close to that.
I'm considerably shorter than that now, but what did you do? You could if I had an ethical objection, perhaps to killing innocent people, I could have been a draft resistor, but I really didn't. I was just a regular kid, so to speak, and I got drafted. I didn't want to live in Canada with my poor, wonderful people, but a winter without houses was not my dream, and it just didn't occur to me to do something else. So went off, crossed my fingers, and I was lucky I wasn't sent into combat. I survived. Friends of mine didn't survive either then or later, and no one in the Army that was drafted, I suppose I should amend that, few that were drafted felt that we should be in Vietnam, but it just wasn't clear. And a lot of the people that made a lot of noise about it were ones who had somehow avoided the service one way or another. And later on, you wonder why everybody, as in Israel, doesn't have a peace, whether it's in combat or public service or something.
When you say peace, you mean a weapon?
No, a piece as in a piece of the society.
I got it.
So you're a GI if there has to be a war, or if you can't ethically do something, you're a medic, or you're in a civilian something for a couple of years where you build housing for poor people, or you do something that contributes so you have apologize for saying this, skin in the game. I hate that term.
I love that. I love that term.
It's terrible. But, you have a peace. So if I were Donald Trump and I had avoided my military service, I would have been apologizing profusely, but it doesn't seem to matter because most younger people, they didn't have the obligation, and it doesn't have to be the military obligation. They didn't have the social obligation, which as an old person I see, but as a young person I just thought, the heck with that. I can't say it on TV, but you get old and sometimes you learn things, sometimes you forget just about everything. But people should have, in a society, and if we consider the whole world a society, that's reasonable, but if you just look at the U.S. or the U.S. and Canada, as I often do, you have some, you should have some obligation to help somebody up off the street, pay a little bit in taxes that take care. I'm going to be collecting, well, actually I am collecting Social Security. There should be something there that calls for a little bit of sacrifice and a little bit of reward. And I don't see that happening. Most of the people in the Trump cabinet, save the military ones, who probably are great people. It's not easy to become a general. I don't want to second guess that. But if you're a business person, if you built yourself up from the ground up, like the doctor, Ben Carson, you deserve a tremendous amount of respect. But if you can't understand that not everybody can do that, there's something missing. Maybe it's just intellectual, maybe it's emotional. And it's a subjective thing. Nobody has to feel empathy for the people around them. Some do, some don't. Just because I'm one of the old people now, I tend to be sympathetic to helping the old people. And if someone has any kind of a disability, we don't fund education anymore in the United States. It's nonsense. When we were kids, you could go to UMass, Salem State, Boston State, essentially for nothing. $25 a semester, or I don't remember the exact, but it was nothing. And even Harvard was, I think, $250, maybe Tufts was $300 a semester. And you could hustle a job, your $8 a week room rent or your $35 apartment rent. That's what I paid, splitting it with a roommate. So it's $17.50. That was manageable. There's no adjusted for inflation. People would laugh at rents are tremendously higher, and I understand it's a more complicated society. Everything's more expensive, disproportionate to simple inflation. But education should be subsidized. Decent education, not just college, although that's important. We don't do a good job with our elementary and secondary school, and we're talking about vouchers for things that sometimes work well, often don't work well, and don't take care of maybe the less advantaged people. Not a good idea. Not if the society wants to grow, remain educated, and be interested in itself. That's why we have people voting for nonsense. That's why people walk into a restaurant with a AR-15, like a M16 on automatic,
Right.
because they heard a story from some evil moron that Hillary Clinton is abusing children. That's so crazy, and yet that seems to be the thrust of maybe a quarter of the electorate, or I hope not that much, but enough to carry the last election anyway. So, sorry, that's a
No, I agree.
point of...
I agree completely. There's no reason for an apology, Alan. We're living in a radicalized society. It's the fear of democratic and progressive people throughout the United States to have a government that is similar to the one that has just been elected. It's a nightmare, and this nightmare has come to become reality.
That's right. And I don't know, other than working grassroots, as you said earlier, working in your community with your friends, with your whatever, your social, church, or fraternal groups, and trying to be reasonable. Because if you're being reasonable, you can talk through some things pretty easily. There still can be fundamental disagreements. You can feel that people, if they are damaged somehow, they should die. That, you can feel that. Calvinism, God's punishing. And I don't think there's any absolute, I would just prefer you didn't. I'd rather, we're all human beings, most of us are greedy, but let's set 10% of that greed aside, or maybe a little bit more, and let it go into something else. And if the society, the government makes you pay the tax, support the school, then good for them, I think. And at least start with that and argue about it. And if somebody says, well, I don't think they should pay for roads or hospitals, we don't have a lot of public hospitals, only in the last 40 years in the US. That's terrible. It only makes sense financially that there be profit motive in medicine. And I know that's a complicated, arguable point. I don't know the answer, but I know the relatives I have in Canada generally have, the ones that, particularly the lower income ones, they have access to, generally, to reasonable health care at affordable, if not without cost. Most of the modern, the so-called Western world, Japan, Northern European countries, other places in the world, have affordable health care. And they do it different ways. It can be private, as in, I think, Switzerland and maybe Holland, but the government controls the nonsense. So the hospital doesn't have to function on profit. It has to function on real costs. And those are complicated issues, and people can reasonably disagree on them, but I think a lot of us are fooled. And when the media is largely controlled by maybe slightly right-wing interests, it's just easy to fool people.
It's true.
If they see the guy on TV saying that Ford is better than that other car, or vice versa, some people will believe it. I might, maybe not, but I'd like to think I wouldn't, but sometimes we do.
Alan, thanks so much for giving an opinion that's, I think, right on target with many the thoughts of Americans.
Well, you can have differing opinions. The problem is, if someone says that poor guy that went in with his gun, that some bad thing is happening, that there needs to be some mechanism, either in education or in the immediate society, whether it's his next door neighbor or his friends or the cop down the street, that says, wait a minute, that really is not reasonable that space aliens have taken over, or Donald Trump, or just crazy things. So, and I don't know what that mechanism is other than people communicating. And if we separate more and more into right wing, and we don't really have a left in the U.S. or a significant one, but and center left, then it doesn't seem to be working. And I don't have the answer. I'm perfectly willing to listen to William Krugman or one of those guys. I remember thinking Bill Buckley was the greatest thing in the world when I was 20, 21, even a little bit older. I went to New York to see the debates with Abe Beame when they were running for mayor, and I just thought he was the sharpest thing in the world.
He really was good.
He was intelligent and
Well-spoken?
He had some heart, and just I thought there were times when his failing was he was always a rich guy, so he just didn't understand. Not that you need to be poor to be empathetic. I suppose Teddy Kennedy, at least in his later years, you can be the heir to millions of dollars and still be a decent person. And you don't have to have my opinion to be a decent person. I say many people don't. But there is something there that isn't translated. It isn't getting out. How could a person that was a draft dodger, disdainful of women, of minorities, of this and that, be a president? It's beyond belief. And maybe it's because he's really not a bad guy. Maybe he's really not unintelligent. Perhaps he has just seen, as an actor, the way to win is to say all these different things to different people, and we all cross our fingers that some of the things that we worry about happening won't happen. I'm worried about Social Security. I'm worried about Medicare. No, I don't get up. I'd rather worry about something more close at hand and lose sleep. But those are, and I'm old, so maybe nothing will go wrong while I'm still alive. But it's not, it's sort of not fair, particularly in those instances, but it's not fair that we don't educate a good percentage of the country. I think that's unfair. I guess you could argue about that. If you deliberately create an underclass, as we helped to do in Chile, I don't know, 1980 or so, the Naomi Klein book, Shock Therapy, relating the U.S.-backed, although hidden money, efforts, Milton Friedman School of Economics from
University
the Austrian
of Chicago,
Hayek,
right? Exactly.
the Austrian guy, and he did terrible. They destroyed Social Security in Chile. For what reason? Other than to give a little bit more money to the upper class and upper classes. And I think they attempted to do similar things in Uruguay, Argentina, and
It's true.
some of Southeast Asia. We don't even say we're sorry as a country because most of us don't know it. And maybe some of the ones that know it don't believe it, because how could we do something that evil? I say rhetorically. And yet we did it. We spent money promoting smoking in China. The U.S. funded advertising dollars, a program way back, but still, that's a terrible. My mother and father both died of smoking-related things.
I'm sorry to hear that.
That's life. So did millions and millions of other Americans. It's just terrible. Sorry, got carried away.
No, I appreciate that. I've got here a series of pictures about the fire that took place.
Recently?
Yeah.
I just had a lady who basically lost everything with a 13-year-old daughter.
Oh my gosh.
She came in just an hour or so ago looking for David Bowie albums and picked something out to lift her daughter's spirits. And, we heard the noise, we saw the smoke, and I wonder who that I know, with my limited ability to remember names, was over there. And I guess everybody's physically okay, but I'd be... It's wonderful that everybody survived more or less unscathed, but gee, to lose perhaps everything you have is terrible. This lady said that, at least initially, help was great. People were helping. The city was doing things. She was fortunate in having a sister to live with, but now she's looking, and her wallet was stolen. She left it in the apartment.
Oh my God.
Just, it's terrible. As a 12-year-old kid, I could shoplift a goldfish. I actually did it. But as an adult, I wouldn't do it because I've had a store for years. And, it's sort of, sometimes you'll learn it's not the right thing to do. I'd like to think I wouldn't grab somebody, it had money in it, somebody's wallet in such a circumstance. But it's hard to put yourself in somebody else's frame, so to speak.
I hear you.
Terrible thing. I hope that people get some of the stuff restored.
Sure.
But that's a social thing. we don't have enough affordable housing, so.
We were speaking about rent control, and that's basically why I thought this was, and you mentioned triple deckers. So this is basically the scene of a fire that took place here in Cambridge a week ago Saturday.
Yeah.
In a part of the city in which wooden housing and triple deckers
Predominates, right?
predominate. So, and it was only 4 or 5 blocks from here. So they said it was a 10 alarm fire or something like that. It was a huge.
I can't remember, but it pulled in quite a few firefighting groups.
This is the mayor of the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts.
I'm ashamed to say I don't necessarily keep up with Cambridge politics. My friend's daughter was a city councilor, Margie Decker.
Oh, yeah.
I would always try to stay on top of things.
Right.
She's a rep now. I voted
She
in
is.
Hawaii, so at least she was. I hope she still is.
State rep, yeah,
I hope I
exactly.
haven't confused that, but nice person. I remember her as basically a baby. Her and her little brother would come in with the dad and the mother, and I haven't seen the mother probably since last winter, but her father was a vet and did die a few years ago. Just a nice person.
Yeah, Marjorie Decker is an influential politician here.
Nice person and smart, the kind of person
She
that
is
should
smart.
be a senator or, somebody with elective influence, because I think her heart's in the right place. She understands what it's like to be from a city and not be well-to-do. She's taking care of her education, and I believe she's living in North Cambridge now. Nice person.
Marjorie
If
Decker.
I voted here, I'd vote for her, maybe even twice.
So I've also got some pictures about Harvard Square, and I'd like to share these with you.
Okay.
I think it's a 7-minute long piece. Maybe we can comment on this. This is Harvard Square in the 60s. Would you have a feeling about that? Were you in the military in the late 60s? You were in
Well,
the
I was in the
military.
military in the middle, late 60s. I was in school in Medford. Tufts was in the Medford-Somerville line, and I lived in the south end of Boston in the days when that was the most affordable area to live. So, although I had family in Cambridge, and obviously we passed through, we'd go, once in a while somebody would be at the church at Cambridge Common. My roommate would drag me to see so-and-so. I wasn't interested in folk music, and that's what I saw at Harvard Square. Well, it was the Automat, Horn and Hardats, I think was in Harvard Square, and I may have the name wrong, but you could get a sandwich for $0.25 and put it in the little machine. I thought that was neat. And there was a couple of eating places in the 60s that were somebody's lunch.
Really?
My friend's older brother worked, I can't even remember.
Somebody's
on Mount Auburn.
Lunch was the
right,
name of it?
Right, now it's a variety store.
Yeah.
Tommy's Lunch maybe. And that Ned Adelman, his mother taught, I think, math at Brookline High. A couple of my friends had her, but Ned's older brother worked there for a long time. I think Ned ended up in Rangeley, Maine, last I heard. So that name is still in the place, and there's a few other businesses, but it's very different in that you could buy an affordable sandwich in 1962, and it was an interesting place. You'd see sort of hippie or precursor to hippie types hanging around, and that was pretty interesting when you were about 18 or 19 years
Sure.
old. Central Square was more real, and South End of Boston then had the entertainment that's where you would see the Temptations or a Wilson Pickett or some old blues guy would be at some Louis Lounge, Bobby Bland at Louis Lounge. That was more interesting. But the Coop was a great place to buy records. In the early 60s, we would go to all the record stores within driving distance probably, and of course cars were cheap then. as well as gas. But if you needed an LP, the Coop probably had the best selection in New England because they stocked everything.
No kidding.
At least that was what the buyer said.
Was it about the one in Harvard Square?
Yes,
Oh, really?
the only one then.
Good.
Everything. And I always would have a friend that was a Harvard student, so you'd get the 5% or 2% discount, whatever. Records were $2 or $3.
Sure.
We would shop at Smile & Jack's in the South End for the latest, whatever. But the Coop would have them as well. And sometimes we buy cutouts in Filene's basement, Raymond's, and Jordan's, because they would have that's where I learned about cheap LPs. They would have discontinued records, 3 for $1, even sometimes 12 for $1. So I'd buy whatever I thought was a rock and roll record. I might accidentally buy Nat Cole, or I might accidentally buy some jazz things, but I would buy all the, from Muddy Waters to the Eldorados, Flamingos, Platters, all the stuff that kids liked in the Chuck Berry, Fats Domino. Things were affordable. Everything was affordable, sort of, and you made 75 cents take home, but you worked a couple of nights at a restaurant, and you could take care of yourself. You could eat, pay the rent with 2 or 3 guys probably, and still go to college. If you were smarter than me, you'd stay in college, go to grad school, and do what you should have done. I just drifted into music almost. There it was. I was drifting along, and there was music. I moved furniture for a couple of years right out of the service. I sold flowers. It was before '74, before the increase in oil. Flowers were largely locally grown. New England had greenhouses everywhere. Now it's Colombia, I think Colombia, Panama, Europe, even some in Turkey.
Right.
Different world. But you could make money on the street legally, and illegally. It just was easier to live. If you had limited education, you could go out and hustle something, especially in New York. You could sell anything and probably make a living. It's probably not possible now, at least not without breaking laws. So that's another part of it's the whole economic, things have become more costly than an ordinary person can afford.
It's true. The economic shift has devastated the blue-collar workers, the poor and blue-collar workers in America.
There's different reasons that are perfectly reasonable, but I think they all would argue for some sort of a balancing, some sort of a subsidizing from the 1% or the 10%. It doesn't have to be. Is it confiscatory? Is that a good word? Confiscatory? It doesn't have to be that. It just needs to be the tax level of the 50s, or not the 50s, that was 90%, but the 60s or even the 70s under Reagan.
Right.
That level of taxes would fund education, it would subsidize housing, it would do things that would make life reasonable. And if you argue that poor people are poor, as a Calvinist might, because God's punishing them, well, give them a break. Maybe give them a little bit of extra hand. And if you're another type of Christian, that's what you should be doing. You should be helping your fellow whatever your religious direction is, I would say.
I think you've hit the nail right on the head. It's basically a question of the Protestant ethic that God rewards you in heaven in direct proportion to how successful you were financially on earth.
It does seem that way. Again, I don't think even Calvinism is that extreme, but it does seem that way, and just people need a little bit of a break. And we, in Central Square, we see drug addicts, and that's another thing, the scourge of these opiates destroying people. I thought when I was a kid, alcohol was a terrible thing. I never took a drink because I could see it around me. But suppose you accidentally took a couple of drinks, or suppose you started smoking. I had polio as a kid, just mild, but I was a little bit of lung problems, so
you had polio as a child? Did I understand you?
Yeah, non-paralytic. I tried to use it to get out of the Army. I brought the note from my doctor.
They drafted you anyway?
Yeah, well, I was, again, non-paralytic. It affects you later in life.
Got it.
Post-polio syndrome.
Got it.
That's life. I mean, here I am complaining, so it could have been worse, although nothing like complaining, especially when you get older. It's sort of the thing to do. So,
Alan, before I forget this, thank you for your service. As a veteran...
people didn't have a choice, and as you well know, if you were smart, I'd say you let yourself get drafted, because then you had to just do the 2 years. But, you know, young people, often unsophisticated, some of my friends stuck it out through 8 or 10 years of college and then had kids and they got out that way. Some of my friends thought they should enlist, being fooled by recruiters into, well, you know, into enlisting. And my uncle told me, get drafted, don't go to OCS, don't volunteer for anything. And he was 20 and 20, 20 active, 20, and the 20 reserve, he was in the Pentagon. So he sort of knew.
That's some good advice.
Well, kid from Somerville, he did all right.
And you wound up going to Germany, and that was...
Yeah, but I'm sure that was just, I suspect that was just luck, although I always often wonder, my uncle's gone now, whether he didn't have some hand in it, but no way I'll know now. And Germany was pleasant duty, you know, you lived in Frankfurt. Germans loved Americans then, and life was easy, 4 marks to the dollar, 3 marks 50 for a Wiener Schnitzel with pommes frites, and I don't drink, so I didn't have to buy the beer, and just, people would buy you a meal. Usually they'd buy you a beer, but I'd say, oh, I don't drink, and sometimes I'd get a glass of milk. Just Germans, because they remembered, they were, at least in West Germany, virtually overrun. And World War II, with my limited historical perspective, does seem like we did the right thing as a society. I hope that's the case. I live in Hawaii, and you know, we're a little closer to the Hiroshima and so forth, but still, if you're faced with terrible choice A and terrible choice B, sometimes you got to pick one of them.
It's true.
I guess if you could go back and find another way to do it, that would have been good to do, but that's what we did. And still, by and large, was still looked upon reasonably well in Japan and maybe South Korea and Taiwan. The world isn't full of countries that love America anymore. But
it's true. And I ask Alan what the world's going to think of us after 4 or 8 years of the Trump administration, and a question as well that I don't believe the news media is actually asking. The question is, Donald Trump said he wouldn't recognize the results of the election unless he won. I think that what the news media needs to concentrate on is whether or not he's willing to give up power after 4 years or after 8 years after he's voted out of office. I think that's a question that needs to be answered, and needs to be answered in front of a camera. Not that a dictator should Trump turn into a dictator with generals at his side and with billionaires in his cabinet. The question is exactly what we can expect out of this administration, but perhaps that's too far. What I would be interested, perhaps in the last few minutes, Alan, if you would be willing perhaps to get a look at this series. This is Harvard Square, I believe. That's a Beetle right
that's
there.
That's a Volkswagen with a large rear window, so it's probably mid-late 60s.
Does this look like Harvard Square as you've seen it?
57 Ford. I can't tell. I haven't caught a store yet.
So they're selling poetry here, apparently.
Well, it certainly seems like Harvard Square. It could well be parts of New York too.
The lighting is not particularly good, unfortunately, in these shots, but it does appear to be Harvard Square, doesn't it?
Well, I have to take your word for it. Again, I can't quite catch any of the businesses. There's no
all they're showing
shots.
is shirts and dresses, basically, and cars.
I saw a sari. I guess Harvard Square would be in the... Wow, that sounds like the newsreel music.
It does, doesn't it? And there doesn't seem to be,
Well, let's assume it's Harvard Square. It's not unreasonable. I was driving the early 60s, 64 or 5, somebody's father's car, and a bus ran into me.
oh my God.
And I remember just rear-ended me. Oh, the Brattle, okay. Must be Harvard Square. Casablanca, okay. One of my roommates loved to hang around downstairs there in the Casablanca.
Oh, they had a great coffee downstairs, didn't they?
Well, it was definitely a hangout. That soundtrack is interesting. That was the
It is.
59 Ford that just went by. So, from the few cars I could identify, looks like early 60s.
Yeah.
The MTA would not, and it was the MTA then, would not pay the damage, and I ended up having to, lucky it was cheap to fix cars in those days, dig up $30 or $40 to fix his father's car. Pretty annoying. Might be the Harvard Square Theater.
Yeah, that it's now closed. It's been closed
It
for a
is?
few years, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's been closed for 3 or 4 years now.
There's the sidewalk clock that was sort of in front of the Harvard, and the Coopers was to the left.
Right there, yeah.
Yep.
Now there's a Bank of America in that area, isn't there?
Well, I don't know because I never get up to the square. I'm looking for me.
You may find yourself
Maybe I'll
in
pop
this.
in.
Have you seen this newsreel before?
No, I haven't. Is that what it is, a newsreel?
Actually, it says Harvard Square in the 1960s, Volume 2.
Okay.
They keep showing this crosswalk. That might be in front of the newsstand, right?
That's out of town. That's not way back. When did they move to the middle?
Don't know.
I lose track of time. They could have done it 40 years ago, but it seems like that they weren't.
You mean the crosswalk?
No, the out-of-town news wasn't in the middle.
Oh, I see. I
You
didn't
don't
know
have
that.
to have- yeah. Well,
The
things
I've-
kind of merge when you
yeah,
get older.
I've only been here 14 years, so
Oh,
I
okay. Oh.
12 years. So I don't really know. I've only known it in that location.
Where did you live earlier?
Florida.
Oh, terrible place, flat,
Yeah.
ugly, redneck.
Miami, hot in the
Oh.
summer.
Yep, used to go there for business. That was a retirement place for East Coast music people.
Really, no
That was the
kidding.
old days.
Wonderful.
Bernie Binnick, the guy that had Swan Records, the Beatles were on Swan, but it was basically a 50s label. Sort of retired there. I'd get out and meet all the old time guys.
Do you like Florida then?
Flat, ugly, full of rednecks.
It's true.
Well, my
You're
cousin,
so right.
one of my cousins moved down there for business. Was a nurse, is a nurse. I guess he's still working. And he was amazed that there were little Canadian communities so that he could communicate in French, which he was proud of speaking. Kid from Lynn. Who knows, why does he speak French? But nice kid. And they liked it. They said the little Northeast US Canadian community, wherever they were, was nice people, and they had the stereotype of, I guess in the Panhandle you still have a lot of the Deep South, but then Miami has a Cuban community. I have friends that basically retired there because they couldn't afford to retire to Hawaii, I guess, and they like it. My uncle said he was right near the VA hospital, and they had air conditioning in the house, air conditioning in the car, and air conditioning in the officers club. So he said for a few months of the year, you just didn't go outside, and it worked. And plus his kids and grandkids, some of them were there. So, family is an important magnet.
It's true.
So
So he thought Florida had a great climate those years that he had access to the air conditioner.
exactly.
It's the same way in Florida today. One of the realities is you have to have air conditioning in the summer. Global warming is making it absolutely essential.
Wait, you mean the non-existent global warming, which apparently, according to the Wall Street Journal, every week they have an editorial by a person who shows no credentials as a scientist, but talks about everybody knows that global warming is non-existent. He cites statistics that, in some cases, you could look it up, that he just made up. But it's that's the word, and that carries, because people believe in nonsense as much as they believe in fact, and no one wants to listen to a scientist. We're not going to put professionals in scientific positions. We're going to put businessmen or campaign contributors in to make decisions that they have no qualification to make. That's the new world.
It's true.
It seems.
And the reality is the rising of water levels in Florida are contaminating the aquifers.
Yes, I read that.
And they're losing access to fresh water.
Yep.
And at sometimes when there's storms and high tides at the same time, the water comes up through
Right, the sewerage system, the water
directly onto
systems.
the street. So
Also in Charleston, South Carolina, which happens to be relatively low-lying, and I think Norfolk, Virginia
Right.
is relatively low-lying, and there's land subsidence operating hand in hand. So the water level's up a little bit, and maybe from depletion of aquifers or some other reason, land has sunk a little bit, and there's neighborhoods that are no longer viable unless you have saltwater plants and a small boat.
it's true. It's a nightmare, and a nightmare I'm certain that the Trump administration, unfortunately, will completely ignore. And the crisis needs to be addressed, and there needs to be serious decisions made that haven't been made since the year 2000, when Al Gore was running against George Bush, in which Al Gore, we're speaking about 16 years ago, had he become president and had he been honest.
A different world we might have.
A different world, completely.
We might not have destroyed the Middle East.
Right.
We might not have engendered the spread of perhaps millions of displaced people into Europe and other places, causing untold misery among them, and perhaps also helping to spread some sort of terroristic response to, abject nothingness. You take everything away from some people, and they may just strike back.
They're going to get angry if you've slaughtered.
We did it. We did it with the fake election. And you'd think people say, "Well, get over it." Well, look at all the damage that was done. And I guess we have to get over it again. There's no real answer. If the Electoral College elects a president, that's it. Any other answer is potential chaos. And the terrible stuff that they'll do in 4 years, we just have to hope that people will have the sense to elect the decent people, because they aren't electing decent people now. They're electing money-driven
demagogues,
candidates that are advertised and promoted by financial interests, which may not all be evil. There may be some perfectly good billionaires out there, but why sell our politics? Why not take money out of elections, as it is out in some parts of the world at least? Why not? Why does seemingly the majority of the electorate want a handful of rich people to make all those decisions? If they were trained something or other, I don't know, scientists, doctors, whatever, maybe that would make sense. You want a doctor to diagnose you, not your cousin Ralph. You want a scientist of sorts to fix your car, someone with training and skills, not, your cousin Herb. But that doesn't seem to apply to our political and social system and education. That's, I guess, the answer. I just don't know how to implement it.
Education would be the answer. I agree completely, Alan. And we have just 3 or 4 minutes left. I wanted to thank you for coming.
But there's nothing I like better to do than talk. That's what I do in the store. That's Cheapo Records, by the way.
It is
right down the
Cheapo
street.
Records.
Because I don't know enough about newer music, If you're old, come right up to me. We can talk about Fair and Young or Muddy Waters or the Flamingos, but if you're young, talk to one of the kids. And then, you know, your uncle and I can talk about the VA or...
Exactly. What is the address? That's 530, is it 530 Massachusetts Avenue?
538 Mass Ave. Excellent question. Next to and underneath the dance complex.
Right.
It's a wonderful place.
An institution.
Well,
yeah.
it's a wonderful place because they're our landlords, so they have to be wonderful. They actually are. They're forgiving landlords, and I try to be a decent tenant.
You're an excellent tenant, I'm
To some
sure.
degree. Wouldn't get carried away, but I try to be a decent tenant.
It's two cultural institutions directly next to one another in Central
I
Square.
couldn't have put it better. Thank you.
And the hope is that Central Square will maintain these cultural institutions for decades to come. And it's the hope that the politicians will find a way to, if not reinstitute rent control, at least to prevent the building of the 21-story apartment building directly at Quest Optic here in Central Square, directly on the left-hand side of your screen. And in closing, thank you so much, Alan, for coming
welcome.
aboard. And do you have a message you want to send to your family or to friends, relatives, or to employees?
Well, I would say shop at Cheapo Records, but that probably is covered with friends, family, and employees. So stick with it. Central Square, 20-story building, it seems to be pushing it. Rent control, once it was removed, and you know the mechanism, it was